I want to talk about a couple things. I obviously want to talk about nature deficit disorder in children, but I also want to talk about the new book, which is called The Nature Principle. The idea of nature deficit disorder kind of, it was part of the book in the beginning, but my publisher, I owe a debt of gratitude because I didn't want that phrase on the cover of the book. And they dissuaded me, which shows what I know about marketing. That phrase has entered the language. It's just a few weeks ago, the National Trust of Great Britain announced that they had a big program now on nature deficit disorder where they were going to try to get kids into all that massive amount of land that they own, that they preserve in England. And it really has made its way not only around the United States, but now increasingly overseas. I never said that it is a known medical diagnosis. In fact, I went to great lengths to make sure several times in the book that this is not a known medical diagnosis, but it is a way to think about a very difficult problem. What I learned right away is that parents, in particular, knew this was happening. Lots of this was happening. This disconnection generationally of children from nature. But we didn't have a language to describe it. And once that phrase goes out there, parents knew exactly what it was. You didn't have to explain it much. After the book came out, almost always an adult would stand up in the audience, or as happened in Seattle, one woman reached down as I was signing books and literally picked me up by the lapels and said, "Listen to me, Rich, adults have nature deficit disorder too. You got to write a book about that." And I said, "Let me go." So part of the reason for writing The Nature Principle is to follow up on that idea, because it's true. I have nature deficit disorder, believe me. I've been on planes way too much. I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, giving a speech at a college there just a couple weeks ago, and the president of the college introduced me, and he said he was embarrassed to say that he'd been reading The Nature Principle on an airplane with his Bose earphones. And I said, not to worry, I use Bose earphones, they're great on airplanes, and my suggestion in terms of that is to avoid nature deficit disorder, you have to read out on the wing. I don't think he's taken my advice. But this issue now, I think, has evolved into something even larger. Particularly in the discussion period, we can get into the specifics of the research on children and nature and health issues, the benefits to cognition, etc. But I think that there's an overarching issue that I deal with in The Nature Principle, more actually in the paperback, because we added a new section at the back. I've become convinced over time that if you pin down most Americans and ask them to conjure up images quickly, don't think, don't be rational, etc., images of the far future, what does it look like? I think that most Americans see Blade Runner, or Mad Max, or most recently, The Hunger Games. They see a post-apocalyptic future, a dystopic future. Amy has told me recently, and it's true, that the #1 young adult fiction genre now is dystopic fiction. And it's not just The Hunger Games. So what does that mean? If I'm right, and I've learned recently that there's actually some science to back me up on that. If I'm right, and that most Americans carry around a future in their head that looks a lot like Blade Runner, where are we going? The phrase, be careful what you wish for, it might just happen. Be careful what you imagine, it might just happen. If we don't have an alternative vision to that, how are we going to get there? I think journalism, my profession, has done us a disservice. I think that environmentalism, to a degree, and I'll be the first defender of environmentalism, how much it's accomplished. But I think increasingly it paints a dystopic image of the future. That's not to say that these problems don't face us, but if we're going around with that image in our head, and particularly young people, of the future, how are we going to come up with an alternative future? Martin Luther King said in many ways, or demonstrated, that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. We need to see that world in our head. My version of that world doesn't need to be your version, but we have to have a positive vision. Just the other day, there was a study that was reported widely about millennials, kids, young people now of college age and high school age. And it found that they care less about the environment than people who are older than them. I have some questions about how that research was done and how they define the environment. It's another issue. But it's almost as if the more we, as environmentalists, talk about climate change, the less people believe us. There's something wrong with the way that we are communicating about the future. Again, I'm not saying I've been a journalist for a long time, and I'm allergic to happy news for happy news' sake. But in terms of reporting, what are we reporting about our future? Not long after Last Child in the Woods came out, I was asked to go to a high school near where I live and to talk, and I didn't want to go. I was home from a big trip and I was grumpy and all that. Then I started thinking, I wrote this book about kids and nature. It's my own community. I started feeling guilty, so I went. I expected 20 high school kids, and there were 200 waiting for me. They've been given extra credit. And I talked for about an hour, and you could have heard a pin drop. And it's not because I'm a great speaker. It's because they were really, really paying attention. I didn't understand why. They were really paying attention to what I was saying. I talked about two things. I talked about the fact that their health, their mental health, their physical health, their ability to think and create was linked and could be greatly enhanced with a little bit more time in nature. That's what this emerging body of evidence is strongly suggesting. This recently emerging body of evidence. The second thing that I talked about was the fact that because of climate change and these other major environmental issues that we do face, everything in the next 40 years must change. We'll need new kinds of agriculture, already beginning. We'll need new kinds of architecture and urban planning and landscape design. We'll need new kinds of cities. It's already beginning here and there. You can see the future. We'll need essentially a new civilization. So when they left, the kids left, I turned to the biology teacher who had invited me, and I said, what was that all about? Why were they paying so much attention? He said, easy answer, Rich. You said something hopeful about the future of the environment. They never hear that. Now, we do hear that a little bit. But usually what we hear is a kind of narrowly defined sustainability. I still use that word, sustainability. I don't have a better one. Thrivability doesn't quite work. But what does that word really mean to most people? I think the subtext of that word to most people is stasis, breaking even, surviving. It doesn't have a lot to do with creating a better world, better cities, a better life. It mainly has to do with we've got to survive. We've got to sustain stasis. I know it means different things to other people, but I think the young people in particular, that's what the word means. William McDonough is the kind of the Einstein of green urbanism. has a famous quote now. He says, "Do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something that's better than that?" Increasingly, I think that what we need to think about is a better world that goes beyond sustainability. Let me give you one example. William McDonough has been a hero of mine for a while, and just a few weeks ago, I was in Virginia, speaking of Virginia, and his business partner, who's a German, was in the audience. Had come to hear me because there had been a big story in the biggest national newspaper in Germany about nature deficit disorder. And afterwards, he grabbed me and he took me to William McDonough's office. I didn't know he was headquartered there. And we spent the morning at McDonough's office. McDonough has a different view of environmentalism. He has a different view of how we talk about our carbon footprint, et cetera. He, for instance, says that he's the guy that wrote Cradle to Cradle. He's the guy that believes that everything can be recycled, and should be, everything. I mean, the chairs in his office are edible. A little balsamic vinegar, but and they don't look edible, believe me. And his German partner commented, he says, "This would be very useful on airplanes if an airplane went down in the Andes." McDonough talks about how we talk about our carbon footprint. I'm not sure I'll go this far as he does, but he says every time we get lectured at about our carbon footprint, we're essentially being told, you don't really belong here. The world would be better without you because you take up so much carbon footprint. You put down such carbon. Well, I know it's more complex than that. Like I said, I won't go as far as he does, but he says, he completes that by saying, when we talk about our footprints as human beings, why don't we talk about what we leave behind, not just what we take? Why don't we think of all of our footsteps as leaving wetlands behind us? And when I was walking through his office, this design of this building caught my eye. It's an amazing design. And he later put it in a tube and he sent it to me, and I've got it on my wall at home now. It was just a few weeks ago. It's a building that he's working on, that he's designing, that will be in Spain. It's a hospital. And it's a multi-story building, 3 sides. One side is all solar panel. These solar panels are done in the colors of a butterfly that is endangered in that region, in that bioregion. Another side is a green wall. The whole wall is greenery. And then the third side of this big building is a vertical farm. There are balconies after balconies after balconies in which their food is going to be grown for the people in the hospital. The panels will provide much of the electricity for the hospital. But the really neat thing about this building is that the ground floor, which is all glassed in, anybody who walks in to that hospital, butterflies will light on. They're going to turn the bottom floor into a butterfly factory of this butterfly that's about to go extinct. And they're going to make a ritual out of it. Apparently, these butterflies all come out of their chrysalis, at the same time. It's kind of synchronized. And like once a week, they open and the butterflies open. So they're going to make this community ritual out of it. Once a week, the butterflies will open, will come out, they'll open the doors and let the butterflies go out into the community. They're not going to stop there. They're going to go to all the surrounding businesses and say, you can do this too. They're going to go to private homeowners and say, you can do this too. And we're going to bring back this butterfly. Now, if you think about that as a building, as a metaphor, this is a building that is producing food. Now, it's saving energy. That's sustainability. It's saving energy. It's energy efficient. That's kind of where most descriptions of sustainability leave off. But it's also beautiful, and it's going to feed people in the hospital. Biophilic design, as it's called, which is our affiliation with life based on E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis. The buildings, workplaces that are being designed this way, similar to this, of having nature designed into them and kept there from the beginning. The workers in those buildings are far more productive, according to the studies that are being done. Turnover goes down, sick time goes down. So in a hospital, there are studies that show that people in a hospital bed who have a view of nature instead of a man-made environment get well faster. They literally heal better. Some of those early studies were done in prisons, by the way. So in other words, you can design, using nature, you can design buildings, neighborhoods, cities, that don't just conserve energy, you've got to do that bare minimum, but produce human energy, and productivity, and health, mental health, etc., physical health. So this hospital is not only saving energy, it's producing human energy, producing food, but then it takes the next step. It's creating life. It's letting life loose in the community. Why can't our cities be that way? Why can't our neighborhoods be that way? I know that's an extreme example, but I believe we can do this. Many of you are in a profession that could help accomplish that. Many of you already know about this kind of design. That's one example of, when you see that in your mind's eye, isn't that a whole lot better than the Hunger Games? Or Mad Max? There's a fellow in Delaware, he's a professor at the University of Delaware, and he wrote a neat book that I like to promote, which is Bringing Nature Home. And his argument is that if we really want the biodiversity that we need, and by the way, the parks with the highest biodiversity are the ones in which that have the most benefit to human psychological health and well-being. There are studies that show this. You want to improve the psychological health of people in a city, and increase the amount of biodiversity in it. You can start with the parks. So Doug Ptolemy, who wrote this book, says that if we really want that biodiversity, waiting for the Amazon to be saved, we're going to be waiting too long. But we have to look at where we are. And he says, what if we changed all of our yards? What if all of our yards included the kind of native species that will bring back the insects and this cycle of life that is necessary for us, too? And he describes quite a bit about how you can make very beautiful yards with native species. My wife and I, a few weeks ago, were trying to practice what he preaches, and we were determined to plant some native species. And we were out there, and I couldn't find any book. I got on the internet, and it's very hard to find which native species are specific to your own bioregion, etc. And I emailed Doug, and he said, it is hard. There ought to be a national database where you could go. There isn't one. Where you can go is to one of many native species nurseries. These do exist. We did that. We were planting these plants. And my wife said, every holiday in December, I go around all the neighbors and I give them little bottles of jam I make. How about this year, we give them little plants? The specific plants we were looking at were plants that could help bring back the butterfly migration route. And then she said we could call our neighborhood a butterfly zone. And I told Doug that, and he said that fits right into my idea. He says, my idea is, what if it wasn't just my yard? What if it was the next yard, and the next, and the next? And you created essentially wildlife corridors. Birds and butterflies don't worry about fences. On private land throughout a city. And maybe the next city, and the next, and the next. And ultimately, we could create a homegrown national park. We don't have to wait for an act of Congress. Now these are kind of symbolic ideas of the larger notion, which is that we have to change where we live. nature deficit disorder cannot be dealt with only by a few programs that get kids outdoors. We have to really look at how and where we live and imagine a better world, imagine better cities. As of 2008, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside. That's a huge moment in human history, and it's largely an unremarked moment. By 2030 or maybe 2040, according to the UN, 2/3 of human beings will live in urban areas. This means one of two things. Either the human species' daily meaningful experience in nature will gradually disappear until it's irrelevant. That's one possibility, or something close to it. Or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. Now, when I talk to those high school kids near where I live, one of the reasons they were paying so much attention was because they could begin to see a different world when we were talking about this. In the paperback, particularly, I talked about this idea of a new nature movement in the nature principle. And in the paperback, we've expanded on that idea in the back of it. I think that we need a new nature movement. This is not to replace the environmental movement, but it's to make it bigger. Environmentalism is in trouble. Now, I know that the Nature Conservancy, correct me, Bridget, if I'm wrong on these ages, the Nature Conservancy, which is the biggest conservation organization in the world, its average membership is 65 years old. Its average new member is 62. 62. One of the reasons, and this is true, by the way, of the Sierra Club, it's close to those figures. One of the reasons that the big environmental organizations sat up and paid attention on the issue of children and nature a few years ago, and the Nature Conservancy is one of those, is because they looked around and they saw people who look like me, who are gray-haired, getting older. They certainly aren't diverse. Go to any conservation meeting and you won't see very many people of color. You won't see a lot of diversity. So they're concerned, rightly so, about their organizational survival, but they're also concerned about the future of the human relationship with nature. The studies show that almost to a person, people who identify themselves as conservationists, environmentalists, had some kind of transcendent experience in nature when they were kids. What happens if that virtually ends? Where will the true stewards of the earth come from? Yes, there will always be environmentalists, but if we're not careful, increasingly, environmentalists will carry nature in their briefcases and not in their hearts, and that's a very different relationship, and I don't think it's sustainable. So we have to reach farther. We have to reach kids who are every day spending less and less time in nature. Kaiser Family Foundation study a few years ago found that kids were spending 44 hours of their week plugged into some kind of electronic medium. A couple of years ago, they updated that study and found that the number decreased to 54 hours a week. People doing the study were astounded. They didn't know there were that many more hours in a week. That's not to say that technology is bad. I love my iPad, et cetera, et cetera. But it is to say that one of the mantras of the nature principle is, the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. Don't feel bad. That happened to me once. So I'm giving a speech, but the saving grace was my sound was a cricket. Where was I? This idea of the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. We need an antidote to the downside of technology. We can't go out, I mean, I don't know in New York, but you can't go to the gas station now, pump gas, without having Wolf Blitzer blaring at you from the, you can't walk through an airport without having Wolf Blitzer on your shoulder. You know? You can't get away from it. There are companies putting advertisements printed on eggs in the supermarket. You can't get away from this constant information that's coming at us from every direction. The people who have studied the impact of the natural world on human development have pointed out that there are basically two kinds of attention that we pay. One kind is the kind it's called directed attention. It's when we're sitting in front of a computer and really focused on that computer. And then there's another kind of attention, which is the best antidote to the burnout we get from sitting in front of that computer or screen when we're working, directed, etc. And that's sometimes called fascination attention. And that's when we're paying so much attention with all of our senses that we don't realize we're paying attention. That is the antidote to the burnout and often the depression that technology, information technology is creating for us. Now, it's creating a lot of good stuff. I love the internet. Believe me, it's a lot easier to do research, etc. As a book writer, you know, I love sending email and harassing my editors. I'm not taking away from the benefits of technology, but we need an antidote to the downside, and there are many downsides to that. The best antidote we have, the place we get fascination, attention, the fastest, the shortcut to that is to go outside in nature. And this is true for kids, for instance. Attention deficit disorder, the studies out of the University of Illinois about attention deficit disorder find that kids with those symptoms, and notice I say symptoms, not just attention deficit disorder, because an awful lot of kids are being diagnosed with that what they have is the symptoms that may be caused by lots of other things. I'm not a radical on Ritalin. Some kids, I think, need some kind of medication. But what proportion of the huge number of kids who are being put on Ritalin, in some schools, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin. What proportion of some of that, not all of it, some, might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from these kids in the first place? The studies out of the University of Illinois show just a little bit of nature, and they're studying kids in the projects in Chicago. A little bit of nature. A walk through trees in a park can significantly reduce the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. There's a photograph that was at the back of a magazine I picked up in San Francisco once. The photograph is a little boy. He's on a beach, and he's racing along this beach. His arms are outstretched. His eyes are filled with life. And the story next to it said that this little boy had a problem. He had the wiggles. He couldn't sit still in school. He was disruptive. The school finally kicked him out. Parents, of course, were distraught, but they had been very observant parents. They'd already seen how a little bit of nature helped their little boy focus and calm himself. And so for the next 10 years, instead of school, they took him to all the great wilderness areas of the West. The little boy turned out okay. The photograph was taken in 1906, and the little boy's name was Ansel Adams. So here's the question. What would have happened if they had put little Ansel in a cubicle called a classroom, in a chair and told him to sit still, canceled recess, which more and more school districts have done, canceled field trips, and told him to sit still and stay there? Would we have the gifts, and also, you know, giving him some pharmaceuticals, would we have the gifts of nature that nature gave Ansel and he gave us in return today? Would we have the support politically for the national park system, and it needs more and more of that support today without his photographs? The other question is how many other little Ansels and Anselettes are out there right now who might give us great gifts in the future if we give them the gift of nature. In any case, these gifts that nature gives us, we've got to create an environment that guarantee that. One of the precepts of the nature principle is conservation now is no longer enough. Now we have to create nature. We have to preserve every square inch of wilderness we've got, but we can't stop there. We have to change the cities, the neighborhoods, the houses, the workplaces we spend our lives in, and the schools, and the school grounds, and we can do this. I'm going to stop here and just open it to a discussion, and at the end of the discussion I want to read you a piece that is in the back of the paperback that I was challenged to do by a high school girl who said that she still couldn't see the world that I had suggested needed to be painted. So somebody